The mahogany boardroom fell silent as Victoria Sterling watched through the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, separating her executive suite from the hallway. There, crouched on worn linoleum beneath fluorescent lighting that never quite reached the corners, was a man in faded navy coveralls speaking in hushed tones to her 7-year-old son. Lucas had wandered from her office during the merger meeting, again. But this time something was different. This time her son, who had never spoken a single word to anyone, not even to her, was moving his lips. The janitor's weathered hands gestured slowly, patiently, as if he were conducting an invisible orchestra. And then it happened. A sound escaped Lucas's throat, soft, tentative, but unmistakably deliberate. Victoria's Mont Blanc pen slipped from her fingers, clattering against the glass table as the impossible unfolded before her eyes. Her son was trying to speak. The Sterling Tower commanded the Seattle skyline like a steel and glass monument to ambition realized. 43 floors of pharmaceutical empire stretched toward the clouds, each level a testament to Victoria Sterling's relentless pursuit of perfection. At 38, she had inherited a failing drug company and transformed it into a biotech giant worth $12 billion. Her platinum blonde hair was always swept into a flawless chignon, her Armani suits pressed to knife-edge precision. She moved through her domain with the calculated grace of someone who had learned early that emotion was weakness, and weakness was fatal in a world built on quarterly earnings. But every fortress has its vulnerable point, and Victoria's was the small hand that gripped hers each morning when she arrived at work, 20 minutes before dawn. Lucas was 7 years old, with sandy brown hair that refused to stay combed, and eyes the color of storm clouds that seemed to see everything but connect to nothing. He had been diagnosed with severe autism at 18 months, non-verbal and profoundly withdrawn. The specialists used words like developmental delay and communication barriers, but Victoria heard what they really meant. Her son was locked inside himself, and no amount of money could buy the key. She had tried everything: private therapists at $300 an hour, experimental treatments in Switzerland, speech pathologists who promised breakthroughs that never came. The latest was Dr. Melissa Cambridge, a behavioral specialist who charged $5,000 a week to tell Victoria what she already knew, that Lucas existed in a world she couldn't reach. The divorce papers had been signed on Lucas's 4th birthday. Richard Sterling, heir to a banking fortune and Victoria's husband of 6 years, had made his position clear during that final devastating argument. "I married Victoria Sterling, not Victoria and her broken child," he had said, his voice as cold as January rain. "I want a normal family, Vic. Kids who can throw a ball, have conversations, make me proud at school events. Not this." He had gestured toward Lucas, who sat rocking gently in the corner, arranging his toy trains in perfect parallel lines. Some betrayals carve so deep they change the architecture of your heart. Victoria had built higher walls after that, working longer hours, pushing harder deals, accumulating success like armor against a world that demanded she choose between her son and everything else. She chose Lucas every time, but the choice left her hollowed out, efficient, beloved by shareholders and feared by competitors, yet utterly alone. Marcus Rivera had been cleaning corporate buildings for 15 years, moving through offices like a ghost in work boots. At 42, he possessed the kind of solid presence that came from years of physical labor and quiet endurance. His face was kind but weathered, marked by lines that spoke of sleepless nights and persistent worry. He wore the same Navy uniform every day, the fabric soft from countless washings, his name embroidered in simple letters above the Sterling Pharmaceutical logo. Most executives looked right through him, seeing only the mop bucket and the methodical efficiency of someone whose job was to make messes disappear. They didn't know that Marcus Rivera had once been Dr. Marcus Rivera, a pediatric neurologist who had specialized in autism spectrum disorders. They didn't know he had published 17 papers on early intervention therapies. They didn't know that his own son, Diego, was 8 years old and had been diagnosed with high-functioning autism 3 years ago. What they definitely didn't know was that Marcus's medical license had been suspended not for malpractice, but for something far more complicated. 3 years ago, he had been treating a 6-year-old autistic boy whose parents insisted on a controversial experimental therapy that Marcus believed would cause more harm than good. When he refused to administer it, they filed complaints. The medical board, influenced by the family's political connections and substantial donations, had sided with the parents. Marcus lost his practice, his reputation, and his identity in a single hearing. His wife, Carmen, had tried to be supportive, but watching their savings disappear while Diego's therapy bills mounted had strained their marriage past the breaking point. She had taken Diego and moved back to her family in Phoenix, promising they could work things out once Marcus got his life together. That was 18 months ago, and Marcus heard his son's voice now only through crackling video calls twice a week. The irony wasn't lost on him. A former autism specialist now pushing a mop through a pharmaceutical building, watching other people's children from a distance while his own grew up 4 states away. But something about the work felt right. The quiet hours, the simple tasks, the way his hands stayed busy while his mind could rest from the constant weight of diagnosis and treatment. Plans. And then there was Lucas. Marcus had first noticed the boy 3 weeks ago, a small figure in expensive clothes who seemed to drift through the Sterling Tower like a sleepwalker. Most children would be running, playing, making noise, but Lucas moved with eerie precision, staying close to walls, avoiding eye contact, occasionally stopping to arrange objects into neat patterns. Marcus recognized the signs immediately. The repetitive movements, the sensory-seeking behaviors, the way Lucas would cover his ears when the elevator dinged or someone spoke too loudly. But there was something else, something that made Marcus pause in his cleaning to watch more carefully. Lucas wasn't just stimming or self-soothing. He was listening. His head would tilt slightly when Marcus hummed while working, and once, Marcus caught him following the rhythm by tapping his fingers against his leg. It was subtle, but to someone who had spent years studying autistic behaviors, it was unmistakable. This child wasn't as disconnected as he appeared. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Marcus began testing his theory in small ways. He would hum different melodies while cleaning, watching for Lucas's reactions. He started narrating his work in soft, rhythmic patterns. Wipe the table clean and bright. Put the papers left to right. Lucas began appearing more frequently on the 38th floor where Marcus worked, always staying at a safe distance, but always listening. One afternoon, Marcus had been mopping near Victoria Sterling's office when Lucas wandered into the hallway. The boy sat down against the wall and began lining up paper clips he had found, arranging them in complex patterns. Most people would have seen random fidgeting, but Marcus recognized it as sophisticated mathematical thinking. He sat down several feet away and began arranging his cleaning supplies into similar patterns. Lucas had glanced up once, made brief eye contact, then continued his arranging. It was the first direct acknowledgement Marcus had received from the child. Victoria Sterling ruled her empire from the 40th floor, where her corner office commanded views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains. The space was a study in controlled elegance, white leather furniture, abstract art in muted tones, and a desk so clean it looked more like a museum display than a workspace. Not a single photograph interrupted the minimalist perfection, though a small leather folder tucked into the bottom drawer held 17 pictures of Lucas. She rarely looked at them during work hours. They hurt too much. Her days began at 5:30 a.m. with a workout in the building's private gym, followed by a breakfast she rarely tasted while reviewing overnight reports from their European offices. Lucas would arrive with his caregiver at 7, spending his days in a converted conference room equipped with educational toys, sensory tools, and monitors connected to Victoria's office. She could watch him on her computer screen throughout the day, a constant background anxiety that competed with merger negotiations and FDA approvals. The latest quarterly meeting had just concluded with news that should have made her euphoric. Sterling Pharmaceutical had secured patent approval for a revolutionary Alzheimer's drug that would generate an estimated $8 billion in revenue over the next decade. Her board members had actually applauded, something that never happened in her cold, efficient meetings. Victoria had smiled and accepted their congratulations, but even as they shook her hand, her eyes had drifted to the monitor, showing Lucas sitting alone in his room, rocking gently while staring at nothing. Success felt increasingly hollow when you had no one to share it with. The penthouse apartment, the vacation homes in Aspen and Martha's Vineyard, the art collection worth more than most people's annual salaries, all of it meaningless when weighed against the simple desire to hear her son say, "Mommy," just once. Dr. Cambridge's latest report sat open on Victoria's desk, filled with the same careful language that all the previous reports had contained. Lucas continues to demonstrate significant challenges with verbal communication. His behavioral patterns remain consistent with his previous assessments. We recommend continued intensive therapy with modified expectations for language development. Modified expectations, medical speak for give up hope. Victoria had stopped reading after the first paragraph. She had fired Dr. Cambridge that morning via email, along with the occupational therapist, the behavioral aide, and the nutritional specialist. $17,000 a month in specialized care, and Lucas remained as unreachable as ever. She was contemplating whether to hire yet another team of experts when the current crisis began. The merger with Biosyntex required her complete attention. Lawyers, investment bankers, and regulatory specialists had been camped in her conference rooms for the past week, negotiating details that would either secure Sterling Pharmaceuticals' future or destroy everything she had built. It was the kind of high-stakes corporate warfare that usually energized Victoria, but today her concentration kept fracturing. Lucas had been more restless than usual, his caregiver reporting that he had tried to leave his designated room 3 times. Victoria had increased his supervision, but during the 10 a.m. break in merger negotiations, she noticed on her monitor that the room was empty. Again. She found him in the hallway outside her office, but he wasn't alone. Marcus Rivera knelt on the floor beside Lucas, his cleaning cart pushed to one side. He was speaking in a voice so gentle it barely qualified as a whisper, his weathered hands moving in slow, deliberate patterns. Lucas sat, cross-legged, not making eye contact, but clearly engaged, his usual fidgeting replaced by focused attention. Victoria approached slowly, straining to hear what Marcus was saying. "See this pattern," Marcus whispered, arranging paper clips into a spiral. "Round and round, like a shell, like the way water moves when it goes down the drain. Everything has a pattern, Lucas. Even voices have patterns." And then Marcus began to hum, a simple melody that rose and fell like breathing. Victoria watched, transfixed, as Lucas began to rock gently in rhythm with the tune. It was subtle but unmistakable. Her son was responding. Marcus continued humming for a full minute, then gradually let the melody fade. In the silence that followed, Lucas lifted his head slightly and opened his mouth. Came the sound, soft but deliberate. Victoria's breath caught. She pressed herself against the wall, afraid that any movement would shatter the moment. Marcus smiled encouragingly. "That's right, buddy. You can make music too. Try it again." Lucas's lips moved silently for a moment, then he produced the sound again, longer this time. Beautiful," Marcus whispered. "That's your voice, Lucas. It's been waiting inside you all this time." Victoria's hands shook as she watched her son attempt something she had prayed for every night since his diagnosis: the merger, the $8 billion drug approval, the empire she had built. None of it mattered compared to this one fragile sound emerging from her child's throat. Marcus must have sensed her presence because he looked up, meeting her eyes across the hallway. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Lucas made the sound again, and this time it was different. This time it was trying to be a word. "Ma," he whispered so quietly Victoria almost convinced herself she had imagined it. But Marcus had heard it too. He glanced at Victoria, then back at Lucas, his voice still gentle but somehow more urgent. "Can you try that again, buddy? That was perfect." Lucas looked down at the paper clips, then up at the ceiling, then directly at Victoria for one brief, electric moment. "Ma," he said again, and this time there was no doubt. Victoria's composure, carefully maintained through hostile takeovers and pharmaceutical lawsuits and the dissolution of her marriage, finally shattered. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, tears streaming down her face as her son spoke his first word. But he hadn't said it to her. He had said it to the janitor. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. The merger negotiation resumed without Victoria, who found herself unable to concentrate on anything except the moment in the hallway. She had given Marcus Rivera permission to stay with Lucas for the remainder of the day, ostensibly to continue whatever breakthrough therapy he had stumbled upon, but really because she was terrified that if Marcus left, the spell would break and Lucas would retreat back into silence. She watched them through her office window, two figures sitting on the floor, surrounded by cleaning supplies and paper clips. Marcus spoke in the same gentle rhythm, occasionally humming, while Lucas listened with an intensity Victoria had never seen from him before. Every few minutes, Lucas would make small sounds, not quite words, but intentional vocalizations that were clearly attempts at communication. At 4 p.m., Victoria's assistant knocked softly on her door. "Mrs. Sterling, the biosyntax team is requesting your input on the regulatory timeline." Victoria didn't look away from the window. "Tell them I'm handling a family emergency." Her assistant hesitated. "Should I reschedule tomorrow's board meeting?" For the first time in her professional career, Victoria Sterling put her son before her business. "Reschedule everything. Clear my calendar for the rest of the week." As the office emptied and the Seattle skyline began to glow with evening lights, Victoria finally approached Marcus and Lucas. They looked up as she knelt beside them, her tailored suit incongruous against the industrial carpet. "How?" she asked simply. Marcus gathered the paper clips into a neat pile before answering. "Children with autism often process information differently, but that doesn't mean they can't process it. Sometimes they just need a different kind of invitation to communicate." "What kind of invitation?" "Pattern, rhythm, predictability. Lucas responds to musical elements, tone, repetition, melody. His brain is wired to understand these patterns, but traditional speech therapy doesn't always account for that." Victoria looked at her son, who was now arranging the paper clips into a perfect hexagon. "Are you a speech therapist?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Marcus's hands stilled, and something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "I used to work with children like Lucas," he said finally, "a long time ago." It wasn't exactly an answer, but Victoria heard the weight behind it. She studied Marcus Rivera more carefully, taking in details she had never noticed before. His hands were calloused from manual labor, but his fingernails were carefully trimmed. His vocabulary was more sophisticated than she would expect from building maintenance staff. And the way he had approached Lucas, with the confidence of someone who understood autism from the inside. "Would you consider working with Lucas more regularly?" she asked. "I could arrange for you to have access to him during your shifts, or we could discuss alternative arrangements." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching Lucas complete his geometric pattern. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a sadness Victoria didn't understand. "Mrs. Sterling, I appreciate the offer, but I think Lucas needs more than I can give him. You should find a qualified professional, someone with proper credentials and current training." "No." The word came out sharper than Victoria intended. She softened her tone, but not her resolve. "No, I've tried qualified professionals, 17 of them. Lucas spoke his first word to you, not to any of them. Whatever you did, whatever you understand about him, I need you to keep doing it." She paused, then added something that surprised even her. "Please." Victoria Sterling didn't say please to anyone. She gave orders, made offers, negotiated terms, but watching her son attempt to communicate for the first time in 7 years had stripped away every pretense except the raw need of a mother who had found hope where she least expected it. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. A recognition, perhaps, of one parent's desperation speaking to another's understanding. "I'll need to work around my regular schedule," he said finally, "and I can't guarantee anything. What happened today, it might not happen again." "But it might," Victoria said, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in possibilities instead of just preparing for disappointments. Lucas chose that moment to look up from his paper clips, making direct eye contact with his mother for 3 full seconds before glancing back at Marcus. "Ma," he said again, clearer this time, and Victoria Sterling, pharmaceutical heiress and CEO of a $12 billion empire, discovered that the most valuable sound in the world couldn't be bought, negotiated, or leveraged. It could only be given freely by a child who had finally found someone who knew how to listen. Outside the Sterling Tower, Seattle settled into evening rhythms, traffic lights changing in perfect sequence, ferry horns echoing across the water, the city's heartbeat steady and predictable. Inside the sterile hallways of the 40th floor, 3 people sat surrounded by cleaning supplies and paper clips, building something that had no corporate structure or measurable profit margin. They were building trust, one whispered word at a time. As the last light faded from the sky, Victoria realized she had stumbled onto something that would change everything she thought she knew about her son, about healing, and about the unexpected places where hope takes root and grows. The Seattle morning arrived wrapped in thick fog, the kind that made the Sterling Tower seem to float above the city like a fortress in the clouds. Victoria had barely slept, her mind replaying the moment when Lucas had spoken his first word over and over, until she could recite every detail. The way Marcus had arranged the paper clips, the gentle rhythm of his voice, the precise instant when her son's lips had formed that precious sound. She arrived at the office at 5 a.m., 2 hours earlier than usual, driven by a restless energy that felt like hope mixed with terror. Marcus wouldn't start his shift until 7. Victoria found herself pacing her office, checking the security monitors every few minutes, waiting for the familiar figure in navy coveralls to appear in the hallway cameras. When he finally did, pushing his cart with the same methodical efficiency as always, Victoria felt her heart rate spike. Today would bring answers. Today she would understand who Marcus Rivera really was, and why her son had responded to him when 17 specialists had failed. She intercepted him on the 38th floor where he was setting up his supplies for the morning cleaning routine. In the daylight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see details she had missed the evening before. His hands, though calloused from manual labor, moved with the precision of someone accustomed to delicate work. His posture, despite the humble uniform, carried a quiet confidence that spoke of authority, earned rather than inherited. "Mr. Rivera," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I'd like to speak with you before you begin work today." Marcus straightened, setting down the spray bottle he had been organizing. "Of course, Mrs. Sterling. Is everything all right with Lucas?" The concern in his voice was immediate and genuine, the reaction of someone who had formed an authentic connection with her son in the space of a single afternoon. Victoria had seen countless professionals discuss Lucas with clinical detachment, their voices carrying the careful distance of people who viewed him as a case study rather than a child. Marcus spoke about him the way a teacher might discuss a favorite student or the way a neighbor might ask about a friend's family. "Lucas is fine," she replied, "but I need to understand what happened yesterday, what you did, how you knew." Marcus was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful but guarded. "Mrs. Sterling, I told you yesterday. I used to work with children like Lucas. I recognized some of the patterns in his behavior, and I tried techniques that had worked before." "That's not an answer," Victoria said, her tone sharpening slightly. "I've employed some of the most qualified autism specialists in the country. None of them achieved in 6 months what you accomplished in 20 minutes. So I'll ask again, who are you, really?" The directness seemed to catch Marcus off guard. He glanced toward the hallway where Lucas would soon appear with his morning caregiver, then back at Victoria. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of internal calculation between privacy and honesty. "I think we should have this conversation somewhere more private," he said finally, "and I think Lucas should be with us when we have it." An hour later, they sat in Victoria's office, an unprecedented arrangement that had required her to cancel 2 morning meetings and instruct her assistant to hold all calls. Lucas occupied his usual spot on the floor near the window, arranging magnetic tiles into complex geometric patterns, while Marcus sat across from Victoria's desk, still in his work uniform but somehow commanding the space with quiet authority. "My full name is Dr. Marcus Antonio Rivera," he began, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the revelation. "Until 3 years ago, I was a pediatric neurologist specializing in autism spectrum disorders. I ran a clinic in Phoenix that focused on early intervention therapies for children with developmental disabilities." Victoria felt the air shift in the room, her assumptions realigning like puzzle pieces finding their proper places. "You're a doctor." "I was a doctor," Marcus corrected. "My medical license was suspended in 2021 following a complaint filed by the parents of one of my patients." The story emerged in careful, measured phrases. Marcus described the 6-year-old boy whose parents had demanded an experimental therapy that Marcus believed would cause more harm than good. The political connections that had influenced the medical board's decision, the loss of his practice, his reputation, and ultimately his marriage, when the financial and emotional stress became too much to bear. "My wife took our son and moved back to her family in Arizona," Marcus said, his voice growing quieter. "Diego is 8 now, same age as Lucas. He's high-functioning autistic, incredibly bright, loves mathematics and astronomy. I see him on video calls twice a week and get him for 2 weeks every summer." Victoria found herself leaning forward, drawn into the narrative despite herself. "Is that why you moved to Seattle? To start over?" "I moved here because I needed to disappear for a while," Marcus admitted. "The janitor job was supposed to be temporary, just something to pay the bills while I figured out what to do next. But there's something honest about the work, something clean about problems you can solve with mop and disinfectant, and it kept me around children even if I couldn't treat them anymore. As if sensing he was being discussed, Lucas looked up from his tiles and made eye contact with Marcus. The boy's lips moved silently for a moment, then he produced the humming sound they had heard the day before. Soft, musical, intentional. Marcus smiled and hummed back, the same melody from yesterday. Lucas's face lit up with what Victoria could only describe as joy, and he hummed again, this time attempting to match Marcus's tone. "How long have you been watching Lucas?" Victoria asked, her voice softer now. "Since my second week here," Marcus replied. "He started appearing in my section regularly, and I recognized the signs immediately. The way he processes sensory information, his need for routine and pattern, the intelligence behind his apparent disconnection. But I also saw something else." "What?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying Lucas as the boy returned to his tiles. Music therapy was part of my practice in Phoenix. Many autistic children respond to rhythm and melody in ways that traditional speech therapy doesn't access. Lucas has been humming under his breath for weeks. I've heard him do it when he thinks no one is listening. His brain is wired for musical communication, but no one has been speaking his language. The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. How many specialists had evaluated Lucas without recognizing this fundamental aspect of how he processed the world? How many thousands of dollars had she spent on treatments that ignored the very thing that could reach him? "Yesterday," she said slowly, "when you started humming, I was giving him permission to use his natural communication method," Marcus finished. Autistic children often suppress their instinctive responses because the world tells them those responses are wrong. Lucas has been trying to communicate through music, but everyone around him has been listening for words. Victoria stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city awakening below them. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the clean lines of buildings and bridges that made Seattle's skyline feel both substantial and ethereal. Behind her, she could hear Marcus humming softly and Lucas responding, their voices weaving together in a conversation she was only beginning to understand. "I want to hire you," she said without turning around. "Not as a janitor, as Lucas's therapist." "Mrs. Sterling." "Victoria," she corrected, surprising herself. In 17 years of running Sterling Pharmaceutical, she had never invited an employee to use her first name. "Victoria," Marcus said carefully. "I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept it. My license is suspended. I can't legally provide therapy services, and I won't put you or Lucas at risk by practicing without proper credentials." She turned back to face him, her expression determined. "Then we'll get your credentials restored. I have lawyers who specialize in professional licensing issues. We can appeal the board's decision, present new evidence, demonstrate that the complaint was politically motivated rather than medically sound." Marcus shook his head. "It's not that simple. The appeals process can take years, and there's no guarantee." "Mr. Rivera," Victoria interrupted, her voice carrying the authority that had built a pharmaceutical empire. "I've negotiated with the FDA, Congress, and foreign governments. I've overturned regulatory decisions that cost companies billions of dollars. A state medical board is not going to stand in my way." The room fell silent except for the soft sounds Lucas made as he worked with his tiles. Marcus studied Victoria's face, seeing, perhaps for the first time, the full force of determination that had made her one of the most powerful women in biotechnology. "Why?" he asked simply. "You don't know me. You don't know if I'm worth the investment or the legal battle." Victoria looked at her son, who had abandoned his tiles and was now sitting quietly, looking back and forth between the 2 adults, as if following their conversation despite its complexity. Because 17 specialists told me my son would never speak, she said. Because I've watched him retreat further into himself every year despite the best care money could buy. Because yesterday I heard him say, "Ma," for the first time, and it wasn't to me. It was because of you. Her voice caught slightly. Because I've been failing him for 7 years, and you succeeded in 20 minutes. The honesty in her admission seemed to shift something in Marcus's expression. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "If we do this," he said slowly, "it can't be about restoring my career. It has to be about Lucas, his needs, his progress, his well-being, and it has to be honest. No guarantees, no promises about what he'll achieve. Just patient, consistent work toward helping him find his voice." "I understand. And I want to bring Diego here for visits. If I'm going to be working with Lucas regularly, I want my son to be part of it. They're similar ages, they have similar challenges, and Diego could benefit from having a friend who understands his world." The request caught Victoria off guard, but as she considered it, she realized how lonely Lucas's world had become. He spent his days surrounded by adults who treated him with professional kindness but never genuine companionship. The idea of him having a peer, someone who could communicate in the same unique language Marcus was teaching him, felt like another piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. "When can he visit?" she asked. Marcus smiled, the first completely unguarded expression she had seen from him. "Diego has spring break next week. His mother might be willing to let him fly out if she knows it's for therapeutic purposes." "I'll arrange transportation," Victoria said immediately. "Private jet, whatever makes it easier for your family." "That's not necessary." "Mr. Rivera," Victoria said, her tone brooking no argument, "I'm about to spend a considerable amount of money and legal resources fighting for your reinstatement. The cost of a plane ticket is negligible compared to having Lucas work with the person who can actually help him. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." That afternoon, Victoria did something she had never done in her professional career. She delegated her most important merger negotiation to her chief legal officer and spent the day observing Marcus work with Lucas. She had instructed her assistant to treat it as a medical consultation, blocking her calendar and routing all calls through her deputy. The transformation in the conference room was remarkable. Marcus had removed the formal table and chairs, replacing them with soft floor cushions, a keyboard, and various textured objects that invited exploration rather than demanded performance. The sterile corporate environment had become something warmer, more welcoming. Lucas entered the room with his usual cautious hesitation, but his demeanor changed the moment he saw Marcus. His shoulders relaxed, his fidgeting decreased, and he moved toward the cushions with something approaching eagerness. "Good morning, buddy," Marcus said, settling onto the floor. "I brought some new friends for us to explore today." He pulled out a collection of items from a canvas bag, a rain stick that made gentle whooshing sounds when turned, small bells with different tones, textured balls that invited squeezing and rolling, but it was the keyboard that captured Lucas's attention immediately. "This makes music," Marcus explained, pressing a key to demonstrate. "Want to try?" Lucas approached slowly, his finger hovering over the keys before finally pressing one. The clear tone seemed to surprise him, and he pressed it again, then tried another key. Within minutes, he was exploring the keyboard with focused intensity, his face showing more animation than Victoria had seen since his early childhood. Marcus began to hum along with Lucas's experimental playing, turning random notes into simple melodies. Gradually, Lucas began to respond, his key presses becoming more rhythmic, more purposeful. When Marcus hummed a rising scale, Lucas found the corresponding keys. When Marcus played a simple two-note pattern, Lucas echoed it back. "He's composing," Victoria whispered to herself. Watching from the observation window, her assistant had arranged in the adjacent conference room. For 2 hours, she watched her son engage in genuine communication for the first time in his life. Not the frustrated gestures and meltdowns that had marked his interactions with previous therapists, but joyful, creative exchange. Marcus followed Lucas's lead, building on the musical patterns the boy initiated, creating a conversation that needed no words, but conveyed meaning, emotion, and connection. When the session ended, Lucas looked directly at Marcus and produced the humming sound that had started it all. But this time he continued humming while walking over to the observation window, looking straight at Victoria. "Ma," he said clearly, then returned to Marcus and hummed again. Victoria's hands shook as she realized what had just happened. Lucas hadn't just spoken to Marcus. He had spoken about her to Marcus. He had identified her, acknowledged her presence, included her in their musical conversation. She entered the therapy room on unsteady legs, her usual composure completely abandoned. "He called me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, his expression gentle but triumphant. "He's been watching you through the window all afternoon. He knows you're here, he knows you care, and he wanted to make sure you were part of this." Lucas looked between his mother and Marcus, then walked to the keyboard and played the two-note pattern that had started their session. He looked at Victoria expectantly. "He wants you to try," Marcus explained. "Press any key, just respond to his music." Victoria had negotiated billion-dollar deals with less nervousness than she felt approaching a simple children's keyboard. She pressed a key, and Lucas immediately responded with a different note. She played 2 notes, and he played 3. Within minutes, they were creating music together, clumsy, experimental, but undeniably collaborative. When Lucas hummed along with their playing, Victoria found herself humming too, her voice tentative but determined. For the first time in 7 years, she was communicating with her son in a language he understood and could respond to. The afternoon ended with all 3 of them sitting on the floor, Lucas in the middle, each of them taking turns adding notes to a musical conversation that had no rules except kindness and patience. As the Seattle skyline began to glow with evening light, Victoria realized that everything she thought she knew about healing, about connection, about the love between a mother and child had been transformed in the space of a single day. Marcus gathered his materials slowly, reluctant to end the session. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Victoria confirmed, "and every day after that until we figure out how to get your license restored." Lucas looked up at both of them and produced a sound Victoria had never heard from him before, something that might have been laughter, musical and light. That evening, Victoria made a call to the most powerful attorney she knew, a woman who had successfully challenged federal drug approval processes and won. "I need you to research the Arizona Medical Licensing Board," she said without preamble. "Specifically, I need everything you can find about a complaint filed against Dr. Marcus Rivera in 2021. "What's the case about?" her attorney asked. Victoria looked out her office window at the city lights, beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness. Somewhere out there, Marcus Rivera was probably video calling his son Diego, maintaining a connection across impossible distance. Somewhere in her own building, Lucas was sleeping more peacefully than he had in months, his mind processing musical patterns that were teaching him new ways to reach toward the world. "It's about a man who knows how to listen," she said, "and a medical board that punished him for having integrity." As she hung up the phone, Victoria Sterling realized she was about to go to war with an entire regulatory system spend potentially millions in legal fees, and challenge professional bureaucracy that had decades of precedent on its side. She had never looked forward to a fight more in her life. The next morning brought unexpected complications. Victoria arrived at her office to find 3 messages from Dr. Melissa Cambridge, the behavioral specialist she had fired 2 days earlier. The woman was demanding a meeting to discuss concerns about unqualified interventions and potential liability issues regarding Lucas's treatment. Victoria deleted the messages without responding. By 10 a.m., however, Dr. Cambridge had escalated her concerns to the state's Child Protective Services, filing a complaint that alleged Victoria was endangering Lucas by allowing an unlicensed janitor to provide medical treatment. The social worker who called seemed apologetic but determined to schedule an immediate evaluation. "Mrs. Sterling," the woman said, "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding, but we're required to investigate any report of potential medical neglect. Can we schedule a time this week for a home visit?" Victoria's hand tightened around the phone. In the span of 48 hours, she had watched her son speak his first words, engage in genuine communication, and show more joy than she had seen in years. Now the state was threatening to investigate her for child endangerment because she had found someone who could actually reach him. "Of course," she said, her voice perfectly controlled despite the rage building inside her. "I'll have my attorney coordinate with your office to schedule something convenient." After hanging up, Victoria sat alone in her office for several minutes, staring at the photograph of Lucas she kept in her desk drawer. She thought about the medical establishment that had taken $17,000 a month to tell her there was no hope. She thought about Dr. Cambridge, whose pride had apparently been wounded enough to involve government agencies. She thought about Marcus Rivera, who had lost his career for standing up to similar institutional pressure. Then she thought about Lucas humming along with the keyboard yesterday, his face bright with engagement and possibility. Victoria Sterling had not built a pharmaceutical empire by backing down when other people decided her choices were inconvenient. She reached for her phone and called her attorney back. "That research I asked you to do on Dr. Rivera," she said. "I need it expedited, and I need you to prepare a defense against a Child Protective Services investigation that was filed by a disgruntled former employee." "How expedited?" "I need everything by tomorrow, and I need to know every legal avenue we have for getting Dr. Rivera's license restored immediately, not in 2 years. Her attorney whistled softly. "Victoria, that kind of legal work is going to cost—" "I don't care what it costs," Victoria interrupted. "I care what it accomplishes." That afternoon's therapy session took place under new circumstances, with a court-appointed child advocate observing from the corner and Victoria's legal team taking detailed notes of every interaction between Marcus and Lucas. The scrutiny should have been intimidating, but Lucas seemed oblivious to the adult drama surrounding him. He went straight to the keyboard and began playing the musical patterns he had learned the day before, looking expectantly at Marcus to join him. The session proceeded as beautifully as before, with Lucas demonstrating clear progress in both musical communication and social engagement. The child advocate, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in developmental disabilities, took careful notes but said nothing throughout the 2-hour session. When it ended, she approached Victoria privately. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, "I want you to know that what I observed today was remarkable. I've been evaluating therapeutic interventions for 15 years, and I've rarely seen a child with Lucas's level of autism engage so meaningfully with an adult." Victoria felt a wave of relief, but Ms. Chen wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "the complaint raises valid concerns about professional licensing and medical oversight. Mr. Rivera may be gifted with your son, but without proper credentials, you're technically allowing unlicensed medical practice. So what do you recommend? Ms. Chen glanced toward the therapy room, where Marcus was cleaning up while Lucas continued to play quiet melodies on the keyboard. I recommend you find a way to make this legal as quickly as possible, she said, because what's happening in that room is exactly what Lucas needs, and it would be tragic to stop it for bureaucratic reasons. That evening, Victoria made a decision that would have shocked her board of directors and probably terrified her shareholders. She called the governor of Arizona directly. James Morrison had been in office for 3 years, and Sterling Pharmaceutical had donated significantly to his campaigns for both governor and his previous Senate seat. More importantly, his brother had a son with autism, a fact Victoria had learned during a pharmaceutical lobbying conference 2 years earlier. Victoria Sterling, the governor said when his assistant put the call through. To what do I owe the pleasure? Governor Morrison, Victoria said, I need a favor, a significant one. She explained the situation in careful, strategic terms. A gifted former physician who had been punished for standing up to political pressure, a child who was finally receiving appropriate treatment, and a medical board decision that was preventing proper care from continuing. You want me to intervene in a medical licensing case, the governor said slowly. Victoria, you know how politically sensitive those issues can be. I want you to ensure that qualified physicians aren't prevented from practicing due to politically motivated complaints, Victoria corrected. I want you to make sure that children like Lucas, children like your nephew, have access to the therapists who can actually help them. The line was quiet for a long moment. Send me everything, Governor Morrison said finally. Medical records, licensing documentation, legal briefs. If Dr. Rivera was railroaded by political pressure, and if he can genuinely help children like my nephew, then we need to fix this. Victoria smiled in the darkness of her office. I'll have everything to your office by tomorrow morning. And Victoria, the governor added, if this works out, if we can get Dr. Rivera reinstated, I want him to consult with our state autism programs. We need more people who understand these children. As Victoria hung up the phone, she realized that what had started as a desperate attempt to help her own son was expanding into something much larger. If Marcus's methods could help Lucas, they could help other children too. Other families who had been told there was no hope. Other parents who had spent years watching their children retreat into silence. She looked out at the Seattle skyline, the city lights twinkling like stars, and allowed herself to imagine a future where children like Lucas had access to therapists who spoke their language, where musical communication was recognized as valid as verbal communication, where hope was based on understanding rather than resignation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the Child Protective Services evaluation, the legal battle for Marcus's reinstatement, the delicate balance of keeping Lucas's progress moving forward while satisfying bureaucratic requirements. But tonight, Victoria Sterling allowed herself to believe that she was fighting for something larger than her own son's future. She was fighting for every child who had been told they would never speak, never connect, never find their voice in a world that had stopped listening for them. In the therapy room down the hall, Marcus was making notes about Lucas's session, documenting the boy's progress with the careful attention of a physician who understood that small breakthroughs could change everything. He was unaware of the political machinery now moving on his behalf. The governor's inquiry that would reach the medical board tomorrow. The legal team preparing to challenge a 3-year-old decision. He was focused only on the music Lucas had made today, the way the boy had looked directly at his mother when he played, the gradual emergence of a voice that had been waiting 7 years to be heard, and in her own bedroom preparing for sleep, Victoria Sterling realized that for the first time since Lucas's diagnosis, she was looking forward to tomorrow instead of just enduring today. The Arizona Medical Board emergency hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in Phoenix, exactly 1 week after Governor Morrison had received Victoria's carefully compiled evidence. What should have taken months of bureaucratic process had been compressed into days through a combination of political pressure, media attention, and the kind of legal firepower that only unlimited resources could deploy. Victoria sat in the gallery beside Marcus, watching a panel of 5 physicians review documents that could restore his career or confirm his permanent exile from medicine. But the real crisis wasn't happening in the sterile hearing room. It was unfolding 3 states away in Seattle, where Lucas had stopped speaking entirely. The trouble had started 4 days earlier when Child Protective Services had insisted on temporarily suspending Marcus's sessions with Lucas pending the licensing review. The court-appointed advocate, despite her positive assessment, had been overruled by her supervisor, who deemed the political scrutiny too risky to ignore. Dr. Cambridge had been brought back as an interim therapeutic consultant, and Lucas had retreated into a silence deeper than any Victoria had witnessed since his early childhood. "He hasn't made a sound in 72 hours, Victoria had told Marcus during their daily phone call the night before. "Not humming, not the musical sounds, nothing. He just sits with his tiles and rocks. It's like watching him disappear." Marcus's voice had been tight with frustration. "He's protecting himself. When children with autism lose a trusted connection suddenly, they often retreat to prevent further emotional injury. He doesn't understand why I'm gone. He just knows that speaking led to loss." "The hearing is tomorrow," Victoria had said. "If we win, if we lose, he'll be damaged by this whole experience," Marcus had interrupted. "Victoria, I need you to understand. Fighting for my license isn't worth traumatizing Lucas. If the board rules against us, you need to let me go and find someone else to help him." Victoria had stared out her office window at the Seattle skyline, city lights blurring through tears she refused to let fall. "There is no one else. 17 specialists, Marcus. 17. You're not just someone who can help him. You're the only one who's ever reached him." Now, sitting in the Phoenix hearing room, while Lucas suffered in silence 1,200 miles away, Victoria felt the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. The legal team she had assembled was formidable. 3 attorneys specializing in professional licensing, a former medical board member serving as an expert witness, and enough documentation to fill 2 bankers' boxes. But the opposition was equally prepared. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the physician who had chaired the original disciplinary hearing, reviewed the appeal documents with obvious skepticism. She was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of rigid posture that suggested she had never questioned a regulation in her professional life. "Dr. Rivera," she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades in medical administration, "you were sanctioned 3 years ago for refusing to comply with a treatment plan specifically requested by the parents of your patient. The board found that you substituted your clinical judgment for parental preference in a way that violated established protocols." Marcus's attorney, a sharp woman named Elena Vasquez, who had successfully challenged medical board decisions across the Southwest, rose to respond. Dr. Rivera was sanctioned for refusing to administer an experimental therapy that he believed would harm his patient. Subsequent research has proven his clinical judgment was correct. She presented a folder of medical studies showing that the therapy Marcus had refused had since been banned by the FDA due to serious neurological side effects. 3 children who had received the treatment in other states had suffered permanent damage. Dr. Rivera's refusal to administer this therapy wasn't insubordination, Ms. Vasquez continued. It was ethical medicine. He was protecting a vulnerable child from procedures that were later proven dangerous. Dr. Thornfield reviewed the studies with obvious discomfort, but her expression remained stern. Regardless of subsequent developments, Dr. Rivera violated the established protocol for parental consent and medical authority. Professional licensing exists to maintain clear standards of practice. Victoria watched Marcus's face as the hearing proceeded, seeing the careful control he maintained despite 3 years of professional exile hanging in the balance. She thought about Lucas, probably sitting alone in his room at that very moment, surrounded by toys and specialists who couldn't reach him. She thought about Diego, Marcus's son, who was supposed to arrive in Seattle for spring break tomorrow, assuming his father still had permission to work with children. Then Governor Morrison's representative, Deputy Attorney General Sarah Kim, rose to address the board. "The state of Arizona has a compelling interest in this case," she announced. Dr. Rivera's methods have demonstrated remarkable success with autistic children, including breakthrough communication with a 7-year-old who had been nonverbal his entire life. The governor's office has reviewed video documentation of these sessions and consulted with leading autism specialists who confirm that Dr. Rivera's approach represents innovative, effective therapy. She presented tablets showing recorded sessions of Marcus working with Lucas, the boy's face bright with engagement as he played musical patterns and attempted vocalizations. The board members leaned forward, clearly surprised by what they were seeing. Additionally, Deputy AG Kim continued, "We've discovered irregularities in the original complaint process. The family who filed against Dr. Rivera had significant financial investments in the pharmaceutical company producing the experimental therapy he refused to administer. Their complaint appears to have been motivated by commercial rather than medical concerns." The revelation sent whispers through the gallery. Marcus turned to look at Victoria, his expression showing surprise and something that might have been hope. Ms. Vasquez seized the moment. Dr. Rivera wasn't just protecting one child 3 years ago. He was identifying a pattern of medical exploitation that the board failed to investigate. His current work with autistic children represents exactly the kind of innovative, ethical practice that medical licensing should protect, not punish. Dr. Thornfield called for a recess, and the board members filed out to deliberate. Victoria found herself standing in the courthouse hallway beside Marcus, both of them too tense to sit. "However this goes," Marcus said quietly, "I want you to know, working with Lucas these past weeks has reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place. Even if the board rules against us, being part of his breakthrough has been worth everything." Victoria studied his face, seeing the genuine care that had drawn her son out of 7 years of silence. "It's going to work," she said. "It has to work." Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant in Seattle. Lucas asking for Marcus repeatedly, first words in 3 days. Victoria showed Marcus the message, and for the first time that day, he smiled. The board reconvened after an hour of deliberation. Dr. Thornfield's expression was unreadable as she addressed the room. "The medical board has reviewed all evidence presented in the appeal of Dr. Marcus Rivera's license suspension. We find that the original complaint contained material misrepresentations about the nature of Dr. Rivera's clinical decisions. Furthermore, subsequent research has validated his medical judgment regarding the experimental therapy in question." Victoria felt her heart hammering as the formal language continued. "However, we also find that Dr. Rivera's current therapeutic work, while innovative and apparently effective, falls outside established protocols for autism treatment. Professional licensing requires adherence to recognized standards of practice." Marcus's shoulders sagged slightly, and Victoria felt 3 weeks of hope beginning to crumble. But Dr. Thornfield wasn't finished. Therefore, the board rules as follows. Dr. Rivera's medical license is hereby restored, conditional upon his enrollment in a 6-month supervised practice program specializing in autism spectrum disorders. During this period, his therapeutic work will be monitored by board-certified specialists to develop formal protocols for musical communication therapy. The courtroom erupted in whispers and movement, but Victoria heard only the essential words: license restored. Additionally, Dr. Thornfield continued, the board recommends that Dr. Rivera's methods be studied for potential integration into standardized autism treatment protocols. The innovation demonstrated in his recent work suggests significant therapeutic value that warrants formal research and development. Ms. Vasquez leaned over to whisper in Marcus's ear, but he was staring straight ahead, apparently still processing the decision. Victoria stood and walked to where he sat, extending her hand. Dr. Rivera, she said formally, Sterling Pharmaceutical would be honored to sponsor your supervised practice program. We have partnerships with autism research centers across the country, and I believe your methods could help thousands of children. Marcus looked up at her, his eyes bright with tears he was trying not to shed. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to build a program that gives children like Lucas, like Diego, access to therapists who speak their language, Victoria replied. I'm offering you resources to develop protocols that other physicians can learn. I'm offering you a way to make sure what happened to you never happens to another ethical doctor. Marcus stood slowly, then took her offered hand. I accept. The flight back to Seattle felt like the longest 3 hours of Victoria's life, despite the luxury of her private jet. Marcus spent most of the trip on his laptop, outlining therapeutic protocols and reviewing research on musical communication therapy. Victoria tried to read quarterly reports but found herself staring out the window, thinking about Lucas waiting for them. Her assistant had sent hourly updates throughout the day. Lucas had spoken Marcus's name 4 more times, had refused to work with Dr. Cambridge, and had spent the afternoon sitting by the window in his therapy room, apparently watching for Marcus's return. When they landed at Boeing Field, Victoria made a decision that would have shocked her younger self. Instead of returning to Sterling Tower, they drove directly to her Bellevue home, a modern glass and steel structure overlooking Lake Washington that she had designed as a sanctuary but had never felt like home until now. Lucas was waiting in the front hall when they walked through the door, as if he had somehow sensed their arrival. He looked at Marcus for a long moment, then walked directly to him and hummed the melody they had been working on before the separation. Marcus knelt to Lucas's eye level and hummed back. Within seconds, they were engaged in musical conversation, Lucas's face bright with joy and relief. Victoria watched from the doorway, her throat tight with emotion. Ma, Lucas said clearly, looking directly at her. Then he took Marcus's hand and pulled him toward the living room, where Victoria's baby grand piano sat unused and perfectly tuned. For the next hour, the 3 of them sat at the piano bench, Lucas in the middle, Marcus guiding his small hands to the keys, Victoria following their musical lead with a sense of wonder she hadn't felt since childhood. Lucas played simple melodies and hummed along, occasionally looking at his mother to make sure she was participating. When Diego arrived the following afternoon, flown in by private jet with his mother Carmen, the dynamics shifted in ways Victoria hadn't anticipated. Diego was 8 years old, tall for his age, with Marcus's warm brown eyes and an intensity that reminded Victoria of Lucas. He spoke in precise, formal language and carried a worn notebook filled with mathematical calculations and astronomical observations. Father, he said upon seeing Marcus, I calculated the flight time from Phoenix based on wind patterns and aircraft specifications. We arrived 6 minutes ahead of schedule. Marcus embraced his son carefully, understanding Diego's sensory sensitivities. "I missed you, buddy. How's school?" "Acceptable. Mrs. Martinez says my mathematics is at 10th grade level, but my social interaction scores remain below average." Diego glanced around Victoria's house with obvious curiosity. "This dwelling has excellent acoustic properties. The sound reflection suggests high-quality construction materials." Victoria knelt to Diego's eye level. "I'm Victoria, and I'm very glad you're here. Lucas has been looking forward to meeting you." Diego studied her with the same careful attention he might give a scientific specimen. "You're Lucas's mother. Father says Lucas communicates through musical patterns. I would like to observe these patterns." The introduction between the two boys was tentative but fascinating to watch. Lucas approached Diego slowly, carrying his electronic keyboard. He sat several feet away and played a simple melody, watching Diego's reaction. Diego listened intently, then pulled out his notebook and began writing. "The pattern follows a mathematical progression," he announced. "Each phrase increases by one note, and the intervals follow a Fibonacci sequence." He looked at Lucas directly, a significant moment for a child with autism. "That's very logical. I appreciate logical patterns." Lucas responded by playing the melody again, this time watching Diego's pencil move as he continued his notation. When the melody ended, Diego approached the keyboard and played it back perfectly, having memorized the mathematical structure. Both boys looked at each other with what Victoria could only describe as recognition. They had found someone who understood their language. Over the following days, Victoria watched two brilliant children build a friendship based on shared understanding of pattern, logic, and the deep need for predictable connection. Diego taught Lucas mathematical concepts through musical intervals. Lucas taught Diego that numbers could become songs, that equations could be felt as well as solved. But it was Carmen, Diego's mother, who provided the perspective Victoria didn't know she needed. "Marcus never stopped being a doctor," Carmen said on their second evening, as they watched the boys work together at the piano while Marcus provided gentle guidance. Even when he was mopping floors, even when he'd given up on his career, he never stopped seeing the child who needed help. Victoria studied Carmen, a woman in her mid-30s with Diego's intense intelligence and Marcus's warmth. "Why did you bring Diego here? I know this can't be easy." Carmen was quiet for a moment, watching her ex-husband patiently explain musical notation to two children who absorbed information like flowers absorbing sunlight. "Because Diego hasn't been this engaged with anyone since his father left," she said finally. "And because Marcus deserves a chance to help children again, even if it's not with our family." The statement carried weight Victoria was still learning to understand. "Are you and Marcus? We're better as co-parents than we were as spouses," Carmen said gently. The stress of his license suspension, the financial pressure, Diego's needs. It was too much for our marriage. But it was never too much for his dedication to children like Diego, like Lucas. Victoria looked across the room at Marcus, who was now sitting on the floor between both boys, helping them create a musical composition based on Diego's mathematical patterns. He looked completely in his element, the exhaustion and defeat of the past 3 years replaced by purposeful engagement. "What if we could offer you a position too?" Victoria asked suddenly. "Carmen, you're a pediatric nurse, right? What if Sterling Pharmaceuticals' autism program could use someone who understands these families from the inside?" Carmen turned to look at her with surprise. "You want to hire Marcus's ex-wife?" "I want to hire someone who understands what families go through when they have children with autism. Someone who knows the medical system, the insurance battles, the emotional toll. Someone who can help other parents navigate what we've all been through." The offer hung in the air while music drifted from the piano. Two children creating something beautiful from mathematical precision and emotional expression. "I'd need to think about it," Carmen said slowly. "Moving to Seattle, starting over again." "Take your time," Victoria replied. "But consider this. Diego and Lucas have found something special together. Marcus has found his calling again. Maybe healing doesn't just happen individually. Maybe sometimes it happens in community." That evening, after Diego and Carmen had settled into the guest wing and Lucas had fallen asleep in his own bed, for the first time in weeks, Victoria found Marcus standing on her deck overlooking Lake Washington. The city lights reflected across the water like scattered diamonds, and the spring air carried the promise of longer days ahead. "Thank you," he said without preamble, "for everything. For believing in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. For fighting a legal battle you didn't have to fight. For giving Diego and Lucas a chance to connect." Victoria joined him at the railing, both of them looking out at the water. "I should be thanking you. You gave my son his voice. You gave me my son back." "We gave each other a second chance," Marcus corrected. "All of us, you, me, the boys. Sometimes families form in the most unexpected ways." Victoria turned to look at him, this man who had entered her life as invisible help and had become something she was still learning to name. "Is that what we are? A family?" Marcus met her eyes and she saw reflected there the same cautious hope she felt building in her own chest. "I think we're becoming one. Different from what any of us planned, but real." From inside the house, they could hear Lucas moving around in his room, probably arranging his nighttime toys into the patterns that helped him feel secure. Somewhere down the hall, Diego was likely reading astronomy texts and calculating orbital mechanics. Carmen was probably making lists, the way she did when facing major life decisions. "The Sterling Autism Research Center," Victoria said suddenly. "That's what we'll call the program, not just therapy, but research, training, family support. Everything you learned working with Lucas, everything Carmen knows about family systems, everything we can learn from children like Diego and Lucas." Marcus nodded slowly, the idea taking shape between them. A place where musical communication is recognized as valid as verbal communication, where mathematical thinking is valued as highly as social skills, where children aren't broken things to be fixed, but complex people to be understood. "Where families find each other," Victoria added, "where parents don't have to choose between hope and realistic expectations." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the lake reflect the city lights, while inside their unconventional household, 3 children, because Diego was becoming as much a part of this as Lucas, settled into sleep surrounded by the kind of acceptance they had never experienced before. 6 months later, the Sterling Autism Research Center opened its doors in a converted wing of Sterling Pharmaceuticals headquarters. Dr. Marcus Rivera served as director, overseeing a team of specialists trained in musical communication therapy. Carmen Rivera had accepted the position of Family Services Coordinator, helping other parents navigate the complex world of autism support systems. The center's waiting room was unlike any medical facility Victoria had ever seen, filled with musical instruments, mathematical puzzles, sensory-friendly lighting, and quiet spaces for children who needed to retreat when the world became overwhelming. The walls displayed artwork created by young clients, mathematical equations translated into visual patterns, and musical compositions written by children who communicated more easily through melody than words. Lucas, now 8 and speaking in simple but clear sentences, spent his afternoons at the center working with other children. He had become an unofficial peer mentor, showing newly arrived children that communication came in many forms and that being different wasn't the same as being broken. Diego visited every few months, spending extended time in Seattle during school breaks. He and Lucas had developed a friendship that transcended traditional definitions, part brother, part collaborator, part mutual support system. Diego's mathematical gifts were helping Marcus develop new therapeutic protocols, while Lucas's musical sensitivity was teaching Diego that numbers could be felt as well as calculated. Victoria had discovered that running an autism research center required different skills than managing a pharmaceutical empire, but many of the same principles applied: attention to detail, long-term strategic thinking, and the absolute refusal to accept impossible as a final answer. On an October afternoon, exactly 1 year after Marcus had first knelt beside Lucas in that hallway, Victoria stood in the center's main therapy room, watching him work with a new client, a 5-year-old girl who hadn't spoken since a traumatic hospital stay 6 months earlier. Marcus sat on the floor with his familiar collection of instruments, his voice gentle and patient as he introduced her to musical patterns. "Would you like to try?" he asked, offering her a small keyboard. "There's no wrong way to make music." The girl touched one key tentatively, then another. Within minutes, she was exploring the keyboard with the focused intensity Victoria had learned to recognize in children discovering their own voice. Lucas appeared in the doorway, having finished his own session with a speech therapist who had learned to incorporate musical elements into traditional therapy. He watched the new girl for a moment, then approached carefully and began humming a simple melody. The girl looked up, made eye contact for the first time since entering the room, and hummed back. Victoria smiled, remembering her own son's first tentative sounds in this same room. Behind her, she heard Marcus say quietly, "Beautiful, that's your voice. It's been waiting inside you all this time." Some breakthroughs happen in dramatic moments, others accumulate slowly through patient work and unconditional acceptance. The Sterling Autism Research Center had facilitated both kinds for dozens of families, but Victoria's favorite successes were the quiet ones. The child who made eye contact for the first time, the parent who stopped grieving the child they had expected and started celebrating the child they had, the siblings who learned that different didn't mean less than. As autumn light streamed through the therapy room windows and children's voices created musical conversations throughout the center, Victoria Sterling realized that the most valuable thing she had ever built wasn't a pharmaceutical empire or a research facility. It was a place where children who had been told they would never speak could find their voices, where families fractured by stress and misunderstanding could heal, where hope was based on acceptance rather than the desire to change what made each child unique. Lucas looked up from his music making and caught his mother's eye through the observation window. He waved, his face bright with the confidence of a child who knew he was understood and valued exactly as he was. "Ma," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the room. "Come play." Victoria entered the therapy room and sat on the floor beside her son, her expensive suit forgotten as she joined the musical conversation that had started with humming in a corporate hallway and had grown into something that was changing lives one note at a time. Outside, Seattle hummed with its own rhythms, traffic and construction, fairy horns and seaplane engines, the complex symphony of a city in constant motion. Inside the Sterling Autism Research Center, different rhythms prevailed: the patient repetition of learning, the gentle harmonies of understanding, the quiet percussion of hope, building one small breakthrough at a time. Marcus looked up from his work with the new client and caught Victoria's eye, both of them understanding without words that they had built something precious from the pieces of their broken expectations. They had found family in the most unexpected places and discovered that the most profound healing often happened not through fixing what was different, but through celebrating the unique ways each person experienced and expressed their connection to the world. And in a room filled with musical conversation between children who had been told they would never speak, love had indeed found its voice. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.